All men are created equal. All men are created equal. It's the lofty and revolutionary ideal at America's core. Yet it was written at a time when some inhabitants were held in bondage, and others were being dispossessed of their lands. How did American society justify unequal treatment based on skin color and national origins? How did it reconcile that contradiction? America created a story of race.
Race was never just a matter of how you look. It's about how people assign meaning to how you look.
We have the idea that it's somewhere written in stone that there are these fundamental differences between human beings. We don't realize that race is an idea that evolves over time, that it has a history, that it is constructed by a society to further certain political and economic goals.
Created over 4 centuries, race has become a powerful and enduring narrative. Moments in America's past reveal how this idea took hold and became the lens through which we view our world. Thomas Jefferson, a Virginia slaveholder, penned the revolutionary words proclaiming human equality in the Declaration of Independence. He also wrote a lesser-known, influential document, Notes on the State of Virginia. Written in response to questions from France about the American colonies, the book reads as a kind of sales pitch for America. Notes on the State of Virginia was not about race, but among Jefferson's descriptions of rivers and seaports, mountains and climate, he expressed his views on the inhabitants of the new land, people from America, Europe, and Africa.
I advance it as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind.
It is possible to make the argument that Thomas Jefferson is the first person to truly articulate a theory of race in the United States. And in effect, he has to do so. He has said in the Declaration of Independence that we are all created equal. Well, if in fact we're all created equal, and if in fact we're entitled to our liberty, then how can he possibly own 175 slaves and going up to about 225 slaves at the peak of his slaveholding?
In Notes, Jefferson's words appeared to justify slavery at a time when many were admonishing the Founding Fathers for espousing freedom, while continuing to support a system of human bondage.
The problem that they had to figure out is how can we promote liberty, freedom, democracy on the one hand, and a system of slavery and exploitation of peoples who are non-white on the other.
And the way you do that is to say, yeah, but you know, there's something different about these people. This whole business of inalienable rights, that's fine, but it only applies to certain people.
The moment when we become a nation is critical for our understanding of both American nationality and race. We accept the notion that all men are created equal, but then perhaps some of those people who are enslaved are not quite men. That is, we'll keep our ideas of American nationality, but we'll write certain people out of the human family.
The suspicions of black racial inferiority raised by Jefferson had evolved over time, shaped in part by an intense need for labor in the American colonies. In 1619, when the first Africans arrived in Virginia, religion and wealth, not physical appearance, defined status. Blackness and whiteness were not yet clear categories of identity.
They were more likely to distinguish between Christians and heathens than they were between people of color and people who were white. They regarded a person's status in life as somehow more fundamental than what color they were or what their particular background was.
The different ways in which those hierarchies of social class and social power became filled in with the content of race, so that the lowest class would be a black class and the highest class would be some particularly pale white class. That was a very gradual process.
For the first 50 years in the American colonies, most of the laborers were European indentured servants, many toiling on tobacco plantations in wretched conditions. With fewer Europeans braving the treacherous journey across the Atlantic, planters facing a potential labor shortage turned to the transatlantic slave trade and gradually replaced indentured servants with African slaves.
They found what they considered an endless labor supply. People who could be readily identified, and so when they ran away, they couldn't just meld into the population like Native Americans could. People who knew how to grow tobacco, people who knew how to grow rice. From their standpoint, the ideal labor source.
Colony by colony, new laws made slavery permanent and inheritable for black people. And for the first time, the word white, rather than Christian or Englishman, began appearing in colonial statutes.
To what extent you could say this was actually conscious strategy, or what extent it was the result of a number of unthinking decisions that resulted in this, but it did buttress a kind of social structure.
As African slavery increased, lower-class Europeans won new rights and opportunities. Some even became overseers and bounty hunters responsible for policing the growing slave population.
The ordinary white people are not going to be complicit in this system unless they get something out of it. My belief is that payoff was in a certain status, prestige, recognition, ego enhancement that ordinary white people could derive from racism. And so there was a kind of bargain struck.
Many of the European-descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. And here you get the emergence of this idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark-skinned people who they associate with perpetual slavery.
Slavery became identified with Africans. Blackness and slavery went together. They gave the white American the idea that Africans were a different kind of people.
There's a racial divide emerging that people begin to see as natural, and that's part of where the idea of race comes from, is just in the tendency for people to see existing power relationships as having some sort of natural quality to them.
By the time Jefferson sat down to write Notes on the State of Virginia in 1781, a plantation economy dependent on slavery was deeply entrenched. Slavery had become so widespread that to many whites it seemed the natural state for black people. But when Jefferson turned his attention to Indians in Notes, what appeared natural about them was their status as a free people, brave warriors protecting their lands. This led Jefferson to suspect that Indians were not much different from Europeans.
Their vivacity and activity of mind is equal to ours in the same situation. We shall probably find that they are formed in mind, as well as in body, on the same module with the Homo sapiens europaeus.
The original view of the Indians was that they were naturally white people and they looked slightly brown because of exposure to the sun and because of the way they treated their skin. Jefferson felt that, among many people at that time, felt that the Indians were good human material, and the problem with them was not race but culture. That the Indians were savages, but they could be civilized.
Jefferson and his contemporaries were also influenced by European Enlightenment thinkers who believed that education and environment could improve people. But when Jefferson wrote about the Indians, he had little direct contact with them. Most Virginia tribes had been pushed west or killed off by war and European diseases.
Those in direct conflict with the Indians, those who were crossing the mountains to Kentucky or Tennessee, didn't think of the Indians in an Enlightenment view. They thought of Indians as savages who were trying to destroy peaceful settlers coming in and thought they should be driven out or exterminated.
There was an ever-encroaching white population who wanted our land. As a people, we were hunters, as anthropologists would describe us, as hunters and gatherers. We saw ourselves as equal people. We were free people. We had always been free people.
Many Indians fought to maintain their freedom and land. Within a decade of independence, wars with frontier tribes like the Shawnee, Miami, Kickapoo, and others threatened the stability of the young nation.
The United States decided that the cheapest, easiest way to avoid an Indian war along its entire frontier and also to acquire Indian land was to, quote, civilize the Indians. Civilization included Christian religion, it included an English education, and commercial agriculture. If you can convert Indians from hunters into farmers, if you could confine them to a small acreage, then you would have all this surplus land which could be open to white settlement.
The civilization policy was actually designed to assimilate us into America. It was ultimately to make us farmers, to live like the colonists lived. The civilization policy was to make us brown white men.
In notes on the state of Virginia, Jefferson implied Indians could be assimilated into American society. But he did not support assimilating black people. He wrote of deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites and of physical and moral differences separating the groups.
Jefferson seems to have thought about it as a Virginia plantation owner who has been brought up among slaves and who, at his heart of heart, I would suppose, finds it difficult to conceive that those slaves are fully as equal.
It was through those eyes that the man who wrote the nation's credo, "All men are created equal," put forth as a suspicion only that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind.
This difference is not simply a product of circumstance. It's not simply a product of the environment, but Jefferson broaches this possibility that it is something much deeper, something innate. We would say in our own language, Jefferson didn't have this language, we would say genetic.
But he says we will not be able to know this until science gives us the answers. And so he calls on science.
He sets American science on the path of trying to figure out what it is scientifically that makes blacks inferior to whites. And of course, if that's the question the scientist asks, then that's the question the scientist will answer.
And so from that moment on, you start to build a case that is specifically geared to tell the world that these people are different. Theories of race are used to do that.
In the next century, as the nation expanded, so would ideas about human difference. Science and slavery would help focus the nation's attention on the nature of black people. But land would propel Native Americans into the racial spotlight.